All right, well, welcome back, everybody. I'm Greg Iverson, pastor of senior adults at Brook Church. This is the second lesson in a series of lessons on the book of Job in the Old Testament, a book we're studying right now because, frankly, well, it speaks to the issue, the book of Job does, it speaks to the issue of having faith in God when going through some tough times and going through some difficult times. And of course, that's exactly what we're doing right now, isn't it? I mean, we're now about 3 months into this COVID-19 pandemic. I don't know about you, but it seems a lot longer than that to me. This pandemic, with all of the concerns that it brings about our health and our economy, and of course, our own personal freedoms. Plus, of course, we've been dealing with just a whole lot of civil unrest in our state and in our country, and even in our world lately. You know, friends, the Bible has a lot to say about having faith in tough times. It really does. But no one entire book of the Bible talks about dealing with tough times from the perspective of faith any better or any more, probably, than the book of Job. Last week, when we started this study, I gave some background to the book of Job before we got into it. And because brevity is not one of my gifts, we only got as far as the first 5 verses of the first chapter, where Job, the man Job, is introduced to us as a very wealthy and as a very righteous man. That first lesson, by the way, last week's lesson, is available on our Facebook page, EBC-Encompass, as every lesson in this study will also be made available along with a study guide. Anyway, we're just getting started with this study. But you know, it's in the very first book of the first chapter of Job, the first verse of the first chapter of Job, that we're told pretty much all we really ever need to know about the man Job. And that's that he was blameless and upright. And those are the exact words, at least in the version of the Bible that I'm using, the New International Version, the exact words used to describe Job as a man, blameless and upright. And we know, of course, that nobody's perfect, but the point is made early on that Job was a good man, just about as good can be, as blameless and as upright, perhaps, as any man can be. But then suddenly, and I really do mean very suddenly, everything comes crashing down on Job. And that's the way life is sometimes, isn't it? Everything seems to be going just fine. It's smooth sailing. Your life is on cruise control. And then one day you get a lab report from your doctor, a report that you thought would be routine, but which says that they found something that your doctor wants to discuss with you. Or the stock market takes a nosedive that you never saw coming. Or the phone rings with news that one of your kids or your grandkids is in some kind of trouble. Or you're told that you should really stay home for a while because, well, there's this virus out there for which there is no vaccine, not yet anyway. Or parts of your city are burning right now, and it's best if you just stay home. Everything is going along just fine. It's going along perfectly until it doesn't go along perfectly any longer. Life is like that sometimes, isn't it? Some suffering is unavoidable, of course. If you engage in some personal vice that you know is not good for you, that may be the reason why you get sick. If you fool around on the edges of what you know to be morally wrong, you may end up paying a price, a big price, if you get caught. If you take a risk and do something dangerous, you just might get hurt. Some suffering is avoidable. But Job didn't do stuff like that. He didn't bring on himself the kinds of suffering that are avoidable. He was blameless and upright in every single way, and still he suffered. Turn to Job chapter 1, verse 6, please. And keep your Bible open in front of you, if you will. All of a sudden, gang, and I mean really all of a sudden, Job finds himself here in the middle of a struggle between the powers of good and evil. And I mean here ultimate good and ultimate evil, between God and Satan. with absolutely no idea why. And it's in that struggle, it's in that tug of war with God on the one end and Satan on the other end, with Job basically as the rope in the middle, that Job's fortunes change in virtually an instant, in a heartbeat, in the blink of an eye. Everything Job has, his wealth, his family, his standing in society, absolutely everything is taken from him, just like that. It all happens suddenly, so very suddenly, with Job entirely in the dark about what's happening to him and why it's happening. But the book of Job tells us exactly why everything is happening to Job right now, doesn't it? You see, what the man Job doesn't know is that God and Satan have squared off against each other in a kind of a contest to find out just how good Job really is. They've basically laid a wager with each other, God and Satan, with the soul of Job as the prize, to see if Job is really as good a man as he seems to be. Job doesn't know that. Job, the man, doesn't know what's going on. But the book of Job tells us exactly what's going on behind the scenes. And folks, the deal here is that it's God, believe it or not, who sort of starts it all with his boast to Satan about the integrity and the decency of the one he calls my servant. It's God in this story who sort of taunts Satan as he brags on Job by saying to Satan, there is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears me and who shuns evil. In other words, friends, according to this story, according to the book of Job, it's really God here who lays down the gauntlet and who dares Satan to pick it up. It's God who starts the whole thing. Now, gang, I don't know about personally how you read these verses, or how you understand these verses. I don't know, maybe you just sort of take them at face value and, just go with them exactly as they are. But let me just say that if in any way you are troubled by these verses, if somehow it bothers you a little bit, or maybe even a lot, to read in the Bible that God and Satan have this kind of bet going on with each other, with the life or the soul of Job at stake, with Job himself as the spoils in this contest. If these verses trouble you or confuse you, or maybe even anger you to think that God might do such a thing, I mean, let me just say that I understand if you feel that way. But what I'd like for you to remember, folks, if you will, please, is what I said in our first lesson about Job last week, about the book of Job, about it being a very old book, written in the 11th or 12th century BC, or maybe even before that. And about Job, the book of Job, quite possibly being the oldest book in the entire Bible. Folks, if that's the case, and I really do think that that is, in fact, the case, that the book of Job is really that old, then you have to remember, I think, that how the Hebrews understood God at that time in their history, that long ago, was not how they later understood God centuries later, or how Christians understood God even after that. I mean, Old Testament writers like Moses and David and Solomon, and then prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all the rest, they all learned something about God since the book of Job was written. And then New Testament writers like Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, and evangelists like Paul and Peter and James, they all learned even more about God, sometimes directly from Jesus. And what those Old Testament writers and those New Testament writers learned after the book of Job was written was just how diametrically opposed God's ways were to Satan's ways. Folks, what we have come to believe over the centuries, because of what is written in most of the Bible and because of what Jesus taught us, is that God and Satan really do not place friendly little bets against each other, especially when a human life, when a human soul is at stake. No, God and Satan, in fact, are engaged in a battle to the death for every single human being. They are mortal enemies, God and Satan, with complete and total holiness at war with absolute and outright evil. The book of Job may tell us that God and Satan arm wrestled back and forth with each other, with Job as the prize, but we know that God and Satan are really not even on speaking terms with each other. So keep that in mind as you read through this book. But this is a very old book. Friends, you already know this, but let me belabor the point for just another minute or so. God does not welcome Satan, previous angel or not, fallen angel or not. God does not welcome Satan into his holy presence as he welcomes all of his other angels in chapter 1, verse 6. And God certainly doesn't have to ask Satan where he's been or what he's been up to, as God does in that same verse. Listen, gang, God has nothing to do with Satan, and he never will have anything at all to do with Satan, because he knows, God knows exactly where Satan has been and what he's been doing, what he's been up to. The book of Job, whoever it was, the writer of the book of Job, whoever that was, got that part exactly right when it says that Satan said to God that he had been roaming through the earth and going back and forth on it, because, friends, that's exactly what Satan does. Peter tells us in the New Testament that Satan prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Listen, gang, God has nothing at all to do with Satan. That's what we know about God for sure. So if already in this study, just the second week into it, you're wondering just exactly how we should read this book of Job, let me tell you how. Remember, not only that Job is a very old book with very old ideas about God, but remember also, as I said last week, that Job is a book of poetry, Hebrew poetry, in which even back then, the writer may have taken some poetic license to make his point. And remember also, please, that something can be true. And by that I mean true in principle, true in essence, without necessarily being historically true or accurate. I mean, Jesus told parables, right? Stories that explained what is true, but which were not historically factual. He made up the story of the prodigal son, for example, and the one about the Good Samaritan. And he made up the story about the man who built bigger and bigger barns. The truths of those stories, friends, are in the lessons that they teach, and not in the details of the stories themselves. Look for the truth in the book of Job, but do it deeply. That's how I think you should read the book of Job. Of course, you may also be wondering if the man Job was a real man. Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, thought he was. Ezekiel mentioned Job's name twice in the book of Ezekiel. And James the apostle, the half-brother of Jesus, who wrote the book of James in the New Testament, he also thought that Job was a real person. He mentioned Job once in this 5th chapter. Others, though, weren't quite so sure if Job was a real person or not. Gang, here's how I would encourage you to think about the book of Job, both about the book of Job and the man Job. This is a book about human suffering. And human suffering, I don't have to tell you, is real. It's very real. This is a book about God, and God is real. This is a book about Satan. And make no mistake about it, even though some wouldn't want to say this, Satan is real. This is a book about the adversarial relationship that exists between God and Satan. And that opposition to each other is very, very real. In short, friends, this is a book, the book of Job, about the holiness and the evil that exist side by side in this world. A holiness and an evil that we can all see. And we all see, of course, all the time, how we are sometimes caught in the middle of that. But as the story continues, look at chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, please. Satan takes the bait when God boasts about Job, and he says, in effect, well, God, of course, Job is faithful to you. He's faithful to you because you've built this hedge of protection around him and around his family and around his possessions. He's faithful to you Job is because you, God, you have given him everything. As a matter of fact, why would Job not love you? You've blessed him in every imaginable way. But, says Satan, take away all your protections now, and I'll just bet you that Job will curse you as surely as the day is long. Satan is convinced, in other words, that Job is the blameless and upright man that he is only because God has treated him so well. So, as the story goes, like they say, the game is on. All right, God says in the 12th verse, feel free to do whatever you want to do to Job. You just go ahead and do that. His exact words in the NIV are very well then. He has, everything he has is in your hands, but on the man, Job himself, do not lay a finger. In other words, have at it, Satan. Go ahead, but don't touch the man Job personally. That's what God tells Satan, and then Satan leaves. The next 5 paragraphs, chapter 1, verses 13 through 19, then tell us everything that Satan did to Job in order to test Job's faith. You can read those paragraphs, those verses for yourself if you want, but basically in order. Satan orchestrates the loss of all of Job's oxen and donkeys at the hands of a tribe called the Sabaeans, as Job's sons and daughters are having yet another big wine drinking party, which makes it look like they're at least partly at fault for not paying attention. To make matters worse, the servants tending those oxen and donkeys were all killed except the one who escaped to tell Job what had happened. And then just as that servant was finished telling Job the bad news about that, another servant arrived to tell Job that all of Job's sheep and his shepherds tending those sheep were all burned up by some sort of fire of God, and that only that one servant had escaped to tell Job. And then as that servant was just about done telling Job his bad news, still another messenger arrives to tell Job that the Chaldeans had just swept down to take all of Job's camels, and that they had killed all of the servants watching those camels, leaving just one messenger left to tell Job what had happened. And then finally, as that servant was still speaking, yet another messenger arrived to tell Job the worst news of all. And that's that all of Job's 7 sons and 3 daughters partying at the oldest brother's house had been killed when the wind blew the house down. And that he, a servant in that house, was the only one left alive to tell Job that sad story. 4 messengers, all lined up with 4 messages, back to back to back to back, telling Job everything that Satan had done to take away his family and his wealth, pretty much all at the same time, all in an effort to test Job's faith. What I want you to notice, please, friends, is that Job is not unaffected by all that has happened. He is not unmoved here. He doesn't just shrug his shoulders and say to himself philosophically, oh, well, stuff like that happens now and then. He doesn't break into song singing, K, Sarah, Sarah, whatever will be, will be. Job is not unaffected by what happens. No, look at chapter 1, verse 20. Job mourns his losses. He gets up, which would suggest that he had perhaps fallen to the ground in anguish and sorrow as all that bad news hit him at once. And he tears his robe and he shaves his head, both signs back then of how a distraught and grief-stricken person would act, all at what happened to him. But Job doesn't sit and mourn forever. No, when Job falls to the ground in despair, and while he was mourning, he worships his God by saying, look at chapter 1, verse 21, he says, he prays to God in verse 21, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart, which is pretty much what Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes a lot later. And what Paul wrote to Timothy later yet, when Paul said, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Job has suffered the most catastrophic day imaginable. But at the end of that day, he can still say, may the name of the Lord be praised. In other words, friends, Job still worships, and he still praises his God on the very worst day of his life. He sits and he mourns, but eventually he worships. And in all of this, we are told, verse 22, Job did not sin by blaming God for all that had happened. So, the score so far, Job 1, Satan 0. Or maybe it's God 1, Satan 0. But of course, that's just round 1. And folks, if you know anything at all about Satan and about the ways of Satan, you know that he does not give up, does he? He always comes back again and again. He always comes back. Chapter 2 starts out a lot like chapter 1, verse 6. The angels come back to report to God, and Satan again is with them. Again, God asks Satan where he's been, but of course, God knows where Satan has been. Satan's been doing what he always does, roaming the earth, going back and forth on it, snatching a soul here and there whenever he can. But again, God can't help but boast about his man Job. You threw everything you had at him, he says to Satan. You arranged for his livestock to be stolen. You arranged for his servants to be murdered and for all 10 of his children to be killed. You took away his wealth and his family. You took your best shot, God says to Satan. But there is still no one on earth like him. He is still blameless and upright. He still fears me and he shuns evil. And through it all, he still maintains his integrity, even though you got me to go along with this little test of yours. Satan then answers God with some of the most cryptic words in this story, as he says to God, skin for skin. Now, just what in the world does that mean? Since I'm not quite out of time, I guess I'll have to answer it. Satan's point here, friends, I think, is that yes, Job has given up a lot, but so far, it's all something, everything he's given up is something other than his own life. He's lost his animals, his oxen and his donkeys and his camels and his sheep, and he's lost almost all of his servants. And he's lost 10 of his children, but at least so far, Job's life has not been in danger. Who knows? Job might have been willing to give his own life for the sake of his children, but he wasn't given that option, was he? So Satan, banking on that idea, that if Job's life was ever at stake, and Job knew it, he would certainly sing a different tune then. Satan here is thinking like the robber who puts a gun to somebody's head and says, your money or your life. That Job, under that circumstance, would stop at nothing to avoid death. Death, he thinks, is the worst thing. Death, Satan thinks, is the worst thing that can happen to a person. A man will give all he has for his own life, he says. Stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, he says to God, and he will surely curse you to your face. To which God replies this time, chapter 2, verse 6. Okay, Satan, go ahead and afflict his body if you must, but do not kill him. And so we are told Satan does exactly that. Verse 7. So that Job now has painful sores all over his body, from head to toe, it says. All he can do as he sits in a pile of ashes, that's basically all he has left to his life, a pile of ashes. All he can do in that pile of ashes is to scrape his itching lesions with a fragment of broken pottery. Now, finally, ultimately, Job has lost everything. He's lost his wealth and now his health and his family. There is nothing, absolutely nothing left. He literally has nothing left to lose, except maybe his wife. But when Job's wife sees what has happened to her husband, she wonders why Job hangs on like he does. Are you still maintaining your integrity? She asks. Why don't you just end it all? Give yourself the satisfaction of cursing God, who must be behind all of this, and then allow yourself to just roll over and die. Don't put yourself through any more of this, she says to Job. But Job will have none of it. You are talking like a foolish woman, he says. And the word foolish here, friends, in Hebrew really means that there is something more than just unwise here, but also something immoral about what she's suggesting. Shall we accept the good from God and then not also accept the trouble? Job asks. And so the bottom line, at least for today, is that Job still did not sin in anything that he said. And I guess, friends, that's the question we might want to ask ourselves as we deal with our own personal suffering right now, or really ever. In the midst of my suffering, no matter what happens, in the good and in the bad, will I still love and serve and praise my God? You know, that's one of the things that I've been asking myself more and more as I am beginning now this year, my 8th decade on this planet. Will I leave this earth with any kind of legacy of faithfulness to my God? More and more, that's becoming the main thing that I want to do with my life before I leave this earth. I may leave some memories behind. I think I will. I may leave some stuff behind, although I'm doing my best right now to get rid of as much of it as possible. I may leave some money behind, although I'm trying to hang on to that right now. But I wonder if I will leave behind something even more important than memories or things or an estate. Will I leave behind for others, when they think of me, recollections of a man who loved and served and praised his God up until his dying breath? I sure hope so. In fact, I pray so. Maybe you might ask yourself that same question today. Will I be faithful to my God, no matter what happens to me? Let's pray. Father, this life is sometimes very hard. It's been hard for many of us, probably for all of us in one way or another lately. Sometimes it seems like it's almost too much to bear, like it's way beyond our ability to handle. Of course, you, Lord, you have promised to share those burdens with us, even taking most of the load on yourself. Help us to trust you enough, Lord, to do exactly that. To give over to you what is too much for us. And keep us faithful to you when even that small portion of what we must carry weighs heavy on us. We love you, Lord. Keep us from sinning against you. Amen. Thanks for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next week.